Hello, Internet. It's Daniel with Driving and Dragons. Back today to do the follow-up, the second every D&D edition. Just a couple of housekeeping notes to start with, though. Generic Jenny D has finally blocked me on Twitter. I mean, it only took like, 4 or 5 months of this channel before she finally blocked me, which is like 75% of her career playing tabletop role-playing games. I thought it was hilarious. The other day she posted a video that was, ways to make D&D more approachable for new players. It's like, you are a new player. And I guess you're a good source of what makes it more approachable for new players, since that's exactly what you are. But I mean, advising people on how to treat the noobs, that's pretty entertaining. I'm also probably going to have to say some things on the old Wizards of the Coast firing layoff situation, just because everybody pretty much seems obligated to talk about it. I find it a massive irony that all the people who've been crying for a boycott and, drive Wizards of the Coast, put the pressure on them, burn them out of business, and now they want to cry about them firing people. Like, it's like, what did you expect them to do? You wanted to boycott them. You wanted to wreck their profits. You wanted to drag them down and force them to submit. What do you think happens when demand goes down? You don't need as many people to produce, so you fire the people who produce. It's pretty simple. This is one of those things, like, this is like being an American in 2002 and being mad that 1,100 Taliban were killed in a bombing run. It's, you bombed the enemy and they had 1,100 casualties, and for some reason you're mad about this? Well, anyway, we're going to move on and we're going to see what Lo-Fi Gaming has to say about the WotC Dungeons and Dragons editions.
This is the good, the bad, and the ugly of every main edition of Dungeons and Dragons. This is part 2, so if you haven't watched part 1, I'd encourage you to check it out. I'll put a link just above in the top right corner. If you joined us for the last one, welcome back. This episode, we're going to look at 3rd edition, 4th edition, and 5th edition. And in the last episode, we looked at original Dungeons and Dragons, 1st edition, and 2nd edition. Put a comment below for what your favorite edition of D&D is, and also let me know if I've missed anything, that you would actually add. And without further ado, let's get into it. D&D 3rd edition was released in the year 2000. In 2003, they did a rules update to the books that you have in front of you. These are called 3.5. Much of the content between the two editions, or 3.0 and 3.5, is the same, but they just did a few updates to, to change the game, streamline it, make certain classes a bit more powerful.
Okay, so full disclosure before he launches into it, 3.5 is my favorite edition of Dungeons and Dragons. I've played all of them, and I do have a fondness for 2nd and for original AD&D. 3.5 is my favorite, and I will say this: I believe that 3.5 is far and away the single most complete and adaptable version of Dungeons and Dragons, period. To me, it is the definitive edition. And you have some people who are intimidated by the crunch or think it's too crunchy or there's too much stuff. The thing about 3.5 to remember is that it is modular. The entire thing is designed, and it states throughout all the different books that the game master, the dungeon master, is supposed to pick and choose and select which variants of which rules to use, which additional supplements to create his world. You want to run a super low magic sword and sorcery Conan the Barbarian style game, there's rules for it and supplements for it. You want to run super over the top high magic, you can buy artifacts in the gift shop type stuff, there's rules and ways to adjust that. You want to do universe shattering, multiverse crossing battles against titans that can destroy gods and become gods yourself. They have rules and guidelines for that. And if you want to run down in the low ranks and never get above level 5, there's rules for that too. There's variants for just about everything. So it's really, I would say, the most customizable and easily adaptable version of Dungeons and Dragons. And I am a storytelling game master. I do believe in creating a story and a narrative. Now, I don't believe the narrative is what should be the narrative is not what should dominate at the table. And the narrative should change based on the rules. Like, you don't just save characters because they're important to the story. You let people die and you adapt. But the tools that you're given in 3.5, I think, make it the most complete D&D version. And that's just going to be me putting in my spiel there so everybody knows my bias.
And really just to integrate some of the community feedback that was taking place at the time. So what is the good of Dungeons & Dragons 3rd edition? The first thing that was quite revolutionary at the time was that the Open Gaming License, or OGL, was released alongside D&D 3.0. This basically meant that third-party publishers could produce content for Dungeons & Dragons, and they were able to sell it. This had actually not been legal, or this had not really been an approved thing before this. And the person that was mainly responsible for the Open Gaming License was Ryan Dancy, but suffice to say, it made quite a big impact on the gaming community, and it really facilitated a lot of third-party publishers to create some really, really cool content. And
the other thing it did is it basically turned the entire community into a massive free team of developers and playtesters for Wizards of the Coast. And as long as they just let the community do its own thing and they didn't meddle with it, a lot of the problems that would have been inherent in the system were worked out through supplements, and Wizards didn't have to pay a dime for it. All they had to do was look and say, that looks cool. Let's go ahead and copy it and throw it into our next rules compendium, or add it as a sidebar in the Dungeon Master's Guide 7. They literally turned everybody into a laboratory to create their game.
Another really great thing about 3rd edition was it streamlined a lot of rules that for years had been sort of a bit clunky, or maybe not as intuitive as they could be. The key ones that I'm thinking here are ascending armor class, saving throws, and formalize the process of skills, and introduced a new concept called feats, which were basically certain abilities that your character had that would enhance or augment their power. One thing that Dungeons & Dragons did to a greater extent than other editions was really sought the idea of balance. Now, this could be a good or not so good thing depending on your perspective, but what it did do is the design philosophy behind it was trying to ensure that there was a more sort of fair and more, I guess, equitable play experience for all people at the table.
Yep. Say a point on that too. That's one thing I've always said about 3.5. You're never going to have perfect balance in any of these games. And one thing to keep in mind, I've harped on this in the past, balance in Dungeons and Dragons or any tabletop collaborative role-playing game is not about balancing the classes against each other to make each character, no matter what class and level they are, equal side by side. It's balancing them against the environment and making sure that they are balanced in their role to, to whatever's against them that's level appropriate. Making sure that they are balanced in being able to serve their role. That said, while there are some standouts in 3.5 in terms of more powerful classes, there's no such thing as an unplayable class in 3.5. Now, you may be able to dig up one that's just really, really rotten out of some of the OGL content, some poorly thought out ideas that got published, or some things that didn't quite work the way they should with all the different things, especially when you start tying in a bunch of different variants. But there's really nothing that isn't playable at all. And unless you have a game master who is running a game specifically for overpowered optimized characters, you're never going to be left out in the cold where you're just constantly a drag on the party.
3.5 is very popular for allowing player choice. And I'm going to say this is another great thing about 3.5. You could kind of play almost any sort of character you wanted. A huge variety of splat books or supplements were introduced, which allowed your character, and if you were really into sort of rogues or scoundrels, as they put it here, there were plenty of rules to make those better, and it was the same for fighters and any other kind of class that you could think of. They introduced things like the expanded Psionics Handbook, which had almost a bunch of different classes in their own right and just tons of rules for if you're running psionics at the table. And really, there was sort of a choice or an option for everyone. The character that you can imagine could be created within this rule set. It also introduced the D20 system. And so the idea behind this was that there was a unifying mechanic for almost everything that you would do in the game. This being the D20, you roll the D20, add some modifiers, and compare it with a target number. And this was really something that if you were coming from earlier editions, a lot of people did appreciate. There's kind of pros and cons to that. I think one of the benefits of those earlier systems was you got this more kind of asymmetrical experience, and sometimes that was really fun and enjoyable. The benefit, of course, with 3.5 is that you got this a more it was easier for people to pick up, and there was this kind of a real sort of unity among the whole system. You sort of knew what to do, and it was fairly intuitive because of that. Another thing, and this might be a little bit of a funny comment, but it still feels like D&D. The first edition I ever played of Dungeons & Dragons was Advanced Dungeons & Dragons First Edition. And I was a little bit unsure when we picked this up originally. We were playing 3.0, but I was a little bit unsure about whether it was the same thing or not. I guess these are the right rules to buy. And I remember playing through it and just thinking how similar it actually felt to AD&D. Yeah, sure, really, really different rules, but the spirit of it I felt was intact. It still felt like that Dungeons and Dragons experience where, you're adventuring, you're creating a character, you're getting attached to that character, and you're just facing off against all of these really iconic monsters, which appear in this monster manual. The artwork's pretty good. There's really nice kind of overarching graphic design to it, which I think still holds up. And the range of monsters in here, like the first edition monster manual, just cover a really wide gamut of iconic monsters for D&D. So you're pretty covered. And then later on, they published more monster manuals. I think it goes up to Monster Manual 5 or 6. Another really great thing about third edition was it actually had pretty good adventures. The Sunless Citadel was kind of a classic first level adventure to get people into the game. We had a lot of fun playing through the Speaker in Dreams. I have very fond and vivid memories of this particular adventure. And then later on, as 3.5 was introduced, you get these kind of more sort of modular campaigns that could be run in sort of sections. You didn't have to run the whole thing, and it offered kind of encounters. But then you could actually run the whole adventure almost as a campaign. So you really got quite a variety of, sort of quite traditional adventures on the one hand, and then you also got, this is sort of approaching fourth edition. This is published in 2007, and fourth edition comes out in 2008. But across that third edition run, you really get a good variety of adventures.
And I'm just going to point this out here. He's only really showing any like official Wizards printed stuff. He hadn't shown anything that's third party on here, but that is one thing. And of course, Wizards, can't leave well enough alone. Screwed it up with the GSL bullshit that they tried to pull in fourth edition. This was the heyday of the OGL and third party creation. Part of the reason you have all of these great adventures is because you have those game masters out there who have run all these different crazy adventures in different ways, who can now actually oh man, remember that awesome adventure we played? Man, that one just really clicked. We've played 500 sessions, but the 4 sessions that were that adventure, man, did they click. That high that you always want to get back to. Now I can write that high down, put that, magnus opum of my DMing career and my homebrewing into a book and sell it. And you get things like, to me, the best adventures were not put out by Wizards. My favorite of all time, best Dungeons and Dragons adventure module ever put out, in my opinion, was by Penumbra Games under the OGL D20 system called 3 Days to Kill. I think it is one of the most perfect adventures for D&D. It is easily adaptable. You can make it a second level adventure all the way up to about a fifth level adventure, so you can always play in there. It teaches players to think outside the box. It has kind of a Tom Clancy Rainbow Six, special forces kind of feel to it with the stuff that's given to the party. You can run it high magic, you can run it low magic, you can make it, I have used it to start countless campaigns. It can be an adventure hub for an entire campaign. It can be a one shot. You can easily run it in one session, or you can stretch it out and make it something that takes several sessions. It's got tons of role play. That didn't come from Wizards of the Coast. And I'm sure that there are other really fantastic adventures that I've never even seen before that were put out by ABC Gaming, and they were one of 2 books that ever got put out for it. You bought it for $2 out of the clearance bin at Books A Million, and holy crap, it's one of the best games ever. You run it until you open the book so many times the pages wore out. Of course, like I said, OGL, Wizards just had to kind of drag that out and piss all over it, and they will never get that back because they will never have that trust again. They didn't even get it with 5th edition. They almost got people to forget with 5th edition, and then they once again whipped out that big old Wizards of the Cock and pissed all over the fan base again.
Additionally, you got some really decent supplements. I think this version of Forgotten Realms campaign setting, to me, is really a good one. It has a lot of information. It expanded on some of those earlier Forgotten Realms entries, and it's fairly flavorful. And I'm not a huge fan of Forgotten Realms, but this, if you're looking for any version of Forgotten Realms, either this or the very original box set would have my vote.
I'm going to point out on that too, and this video is going to get long if I keep stopping for all the great stuff about 3.5, because I can't say enough good about it. But part of the reason why those big campaign setting style books were so good for 3.5, once again, is the OGL. Wizards didn't have to dedicate staff and resources to punching out, a couple of adventure modules every few months to keep their appetite whetted, keep them coming back, and keep them wanting to look at the bookstore over and over again. They had the third-party publishers doing that, and that freed them up to focus on those big seminal works that take a true professional production team without having to worry about the market going cold on them. So it allowed them to just create better quality when it came to that, as opposed to the dross you get in 5th edition where they're having to rush this crap out. And then, of course, with the ridiculous wokeism that goes on where they then turn around and sensitivity reader it into mindless oblivion, where it's just a sanitized, they may as well just print everything in grayscale because there's no color to the entire world.
One other comment I'd like to make is, the Dungeon and Dragon magazines that came out around this time, published by Paizo, who went on to create Pathfinder. It had some really good content in them, whether that was additional rules for D&D, or whether it was adventures. And a lot of the dungeon magazines had just quite awesome and quite creative adventures in them. We played through a lot of those too. Now, what about the cons? Well, I said before that the player choice was good. I think one of the drawbacks of 3.5, if I'm being honest, is just that there is kind of too much material. Now, take that with a grain of salt, because you can actually just play, with kind of the 3 core books. But inevitably, players know there's those options, and they're going to want to play some of that stuff. So
Yeah, it's very, very easy to get lost in 3.5 because there's so much stuff. And the biggest mistake I see game masters going back in time trying to play 3.5 for the first time as oh well, I want to go find out what this 3.5 is like. Is they try to use everything. They basically try to use all the supplements, all the rules, and they get lost and overwhelmed, and everything's just kind of a disaster. And then it also gets annoying with players because like I'll start a 3.5 group and I'll have a newer player, and it's like, okay, let's start with that player's handbook. But then I'll have a experienced player who wants to pull 14 different feats from 12 different supplements to build this, because he's been building 3.5 characters since 2000. And it can be a bit of a mess because then you get that player getting irritated when you start saying, no, you can't do this. No, you can't do that. I've had players come to join my 3.5 game and not even make it to session 0 because I've shot down 15 different character ideas because I'm like, no, that doesn't exist in this world. That does not exist in this world. Please go read the lore section that I put together for our 3.5 homebrew world. I gave you a handout that tells you the kind of stuff that's in this world. Quit going and picking crazy stuff out of this book and that book because you want to be this kind of overpowered. You can get lost in 3.5 very, very easily. Plus, the dark side of the OGL is there was a lot of crap out there. And it's easy to get blindsided by accidentally allowing some completely broken thing from some weird supplement if you're not paying attention.
As a DM, you have to be really vigilant about deciding what you do or don't include in a game. It's not necessarily a problem, but the game can be quite crunchy, and especially at high levels where characters are dealing with having a high base attack and having multiple attacks each turn and dealing with spells like that are altering time, it can get quite complex. In a similar vein, it can be quite hard to prep if you're creating your own homebrew stuff. The stat blocks are often really enormous. So for example, let's take the Aladrin here. It has a little bit of a write-up, not much actually, but just a little bit of a write-up there. It starts the stat block there, tells us how much hit dice and hit points it has, how much initiative bonus, how fast it is, what its AC is. And then we've got all this other stuff too, like the base attack, grapple and attacks and full attacks and space and reach and special attacks and special qualities and saves. And if you compare that with earlier editions of D&D, this is really quite a lot to wade through, and especially a lot if you're trying to prep. To me, it generally feels with 3.5 that there's a bit of rules bloat. Another point that I want to make is just that the min-maxing sort of thing with players. In other words, they wanted to make the very best optimized character. They wanted that character to be absolutely awesome, and they wanted it to be better than everyone else's. And this was the kind of game that if you did a lot of research and you poured through all of the supplements and the different rules and different kind of prestige classes and options for characters, you could create something that was pretty imbalanced for the game that you were playing in. Finally, the last point that I want to make is just around character creation. And sometimes with 3.5, this could just take quite a long time, especially if you were adding those additional rules. You had to read, the write-ups about each race. And I mean, look, this is at the entry for the dwarf, 1.5 pages of text just for the dwarves. And then when you get into classes, it's no better really. Like it can be quite complicated, especially when you start having spellcasters. That experience could be quite overwhelming, especially for new players or someone who just wants to create a character and get into the game and isn't too bothered about optimizing. It's 2000.
Okay, one thing I'm going to dunk on 3.5 here a little bit too. Yes, you have the complexity and everything that goes into it. This touches off of one of the things he said about prep. Right now, I am running 2 different groups. I run a Discord group for 3.5, and I run a Cyberpunk Red group. And these are the 2 groups I'm running right now. I'm running these 2 different games. And it's night and day. I can spend 2 hours and prep weeks and multiple sessions of material for Cyberpunk Red very, very easily and just need to go back and tweak it a little bit. Dungeons and Dragons 3.5 takes hours and hours and hours to prep a session well. There is no question about it, is that if you're a busy professional and whatnot, you might have to give up some of your other hobbies if you're really going to be a 3.5 dungeon master, especially if you have a group that knows what they're doing. Because if you don't put in all that extra time and effort for prep, your players, you get a good optimizer in your group, a good min-maxer, he'll break your game 6 different ways from Sunday, because you better believe that he's going to prepare his one character and you have to prepare an entire world that can deal with it. With that kind of complexity, you're going to be putting in some hours. So I would say 3.5 is probably the worst edition for a DM who does not have a pretty decent amount of time to dedicate to prep.
And 8. Massively multiplayer online role-playing games are taking off. MMOs are taking off. Games like World of Warcraft are dominating. And I think Wizards of the Coast really got kind of caught up in that with this edition of the game.
Yeah, there's no doubt about it. 4th edition was 100% geared towards that video gamer mentality I've mentioned in previous videos, where you can almost see the quick save icon pop up in the in 4th edition. And 4th edition is 4th edition is actually not a bad game if all you want to do is run around and swing swords and hit stuff for experience points. If you just want to run up to the dragon and click your macro and watch your character cycle through their abilities, 4th edition is not bad. But 4th edition is way more akin to like Battletech or Mage Knight or Warhammer than it is to Dungeons and Dragons. It's almost like going back to chainmail. It's basically it's like playing a Fallout game.
4th edition. It's really easy and plain to see the influence of online gaming and the effect that had on RPGs. After 3rd edition, this has been kind of known as quite a hated version of Dungeons and Dragons. What was really odd about this is you would think that by now this is all you need to play. You need a player's handbook, a Dungeon Master's Guide, and a monster manual. But no, you actually need this and this as well.
I will say this too, ironically, as he pointed out there, this is the irony of it. If this game had come out as 2nd edition right after AD&D, it would not be hated. It would probably be loved. What makes 4th edition so unbelievably hated is because of the Hickman Revolution. Dungeons and Dragons, no matter what the BroSR especially, and the OSR really want to tell you, Dungeons and Dragons is a storytelling game. That's all there is to it, is a collaborative storytelling and role-playing game, and it has been that way since at least 2nd edition, probably late 1st edition, because that Hickman Revolution took the game completely away from the wargaming roots and turned it into this collaborative storytelling game. And the players that came from the early 80s all the way up till now came from that school of thought, and that's the way they like to play, and that's what enticed them to play. Then they pull out this 4th edition game, and it is horrible for that. It is a terrible storytelling game. It is a terrible role-playing game. It is an action-adventure game. It is not a role-playing game, and that's the reason why it's hated so much by most of the D&D player base, because the vast majority of us are storytelling players.
This, for me, has actually been the hardest one to talk about. I want to be fair about it. I don't want to just unnecessarily kind of dump on this. I want to give some good reasons why it's good and some good reasons why it's not so good. And often I found, as I was putting these together, that some of the good was actually a con as well. So sometimes there's a bit of crossover in what I talk about here. On the face of it, one of the really good things about D&D 4th edition is that it tries to make things equal for all players. there's a lot of consistency. There's a lot of equality here. A lot of the classes are quite balanced to one another. And really you get this internal system that has kind of, it wants things to be fair, it wants things to feel fun, and it wants things to be kind of balanced. Some of the monster design in D&D 4th edition is particularly good. By the time we get a bit later into the life cycle of 4th edition, you really start to see some really cool things with the monster design. And so here we have about 4 different versions of the same thing, the Fell Drake. And depending on what level or what sort of relative power this is, it gives us different rules for that. It gives us kind of some DM AI that can be used to make the experience of fighting this creature a little bit more fair. And the stat blocks are definitely not as not as long and not as dense as 3rd edition, and it breaks it up really nicely into standard actions and move actions, and it gives like triggered actions. The other mechanic that it introduced, which was awesome, is the bloodied mechanic, and that's usually half the creature's hit points. When it becomes bloodied, it usually activates some kind of like a triggered response. And what this did was it created a lot of kind of like variability to the monsters that you would encounter. You might encounter a kobold, but that kobold, you never knew what to expect with that kobold, because it could be, just a stock standard kind of kobold. It could be a kobold with a special ability, and that bloodied effect, you just never knew how it's going to impact the game as you start to take some of this monster's hit die down. What's going to happen as you reduce hit points? What new threat is going to emerge? And to me, that was just really good monster design. There was kind of that AI element to it, where rather than it just being a kind of a punching bag for the players to eventually just reduce its hit points, it felt like the monster was more living and breathing and had a bit more autonomy to what it was doing.
I would call that training wheels, especially 3.5, but all throughout Dungeons and Dragons monsters always had that kind of variability and vermicilla. Can't speak tonight; it's late. The fact of the matter is that that is not something that 4th E did. 4E just codified it. They just put it in there that this monster starts doing this kind of stuff as we get lower, and you make this adjustment and this adjustment. It's like having training wheels on. You could do all that very easily in 3.5 and 2nd and 1st. You could adjust the monster. They'd adjust their tactics. You think for them. You as the game master were expected to think for them. 4th edition, you're just kind of given the program.
In 2010, they released the Essentials line, and they did a lot to kind of clean up and simplify the experience for new players getting into the game. And the Essentials did consolidate and sort of streamline a lot of the existing rules. You start getting products like this one, which we've kind of already gone over a little bit, and this came out in 2011, but it still fits into that sort of Essentials line where they revamp the monsters. Another thing that 4th edition did was really put the attention on miniatures use. It really encouraged miniatures use, and in some ways that actually makes the table a lot more of a visceral and tangible experience. Another good thing about it is that it was very action focused. It really sort of played with the idea of action and different players having strengths and things that they could do, and abilities. And really, the characters from the outset are heroes, and they can go in and have actions that they complete just from the outset. There were really clear character paths that you could develop, and where 3.5 could go into a lot of different areas, 4th edition kind of created these paths that best suited your character. So it's quite a different sort of character design than what we were used to in the past. What is the bad and the ugly for Dungeons & Dragons 4th edition? One of the questions that I saw get thrown around a lot was, is this even D&D? And for me, I didn't really get into this game at all for quite a long time, not until after 5th edition was released. And when I started getting into it, I had actually reframed it for myself and said, yeah, if I think about this as not D&D, it's actually a pretty cool game. And I'm not saying it's not Dungeons and Dragons, but I think if you think about what came before and even what's come afterwards, this was such a departure that I truly think it was hard for people to get their head around. There were quite a few innovations and things about it that were really appealing. But ultimately, I just think it was just too different. And that really did throw some people off. The second thing is the adventures. While there were certainly some good adventures in fourth edition, some of them were just really average. I don't really want to go on about that, but that is something to think about. Another bad thing about fourth edition, it's not unique to fourth edition, but I think we see this play out a lot more evidently with the release of fourth edition, was that fracturing of the fan base. Now, this happened every time a new edition of D&D was released, but with fourth edition, it was particularly evident because we see players go from being diehard Dungeons and Dragons fans to moving over to Pathfinder 1E. When Pathfinder comes out, a lot of the players that are playing third edition switch over to Pathfinder because that to them is more D&D than fourth edition. The effect of this is that there was not a lot of consolidation, or there wasn't a real sense of kind of, in some ways, community, or there wasn't a single-mindedness around D&D at the time. It felt like there's like the edition wars and people are kind of going off at each other online, and it was just generally unpleasant. The thing I always say about this is, like, if you like Dungeons and Dragons, we have more in common than not, and just enjoy. I would be happy to sit down and play pretty much every edition of D&D, and I think that was something that really got lost during the fourth edition time. People just kind of were hating on each other in the edition just for the sake of it, and you really saw that fracturing of the fan base take place at this point in time. I talked about earlier the fact that the miniature use could be quite good in adding this sort of this visceral kind of tangible physicality to the game. But by the same token, this system was just assumed and almost demanded that you use miniatures. And sometimes you just want to play a game and you just want it to be your imagination. Sometimes you don't want to pull out a whole horde of miniatures. You just want to enjoy it. And sometimes I think the use of miniatures can be limiting to the imagination. Another thing fourth edition did was just released a lot of kind of powers. And so the way that the classes worked in fourth edition was that they all had powers. And so each, rather than having that traditional kind of supplement, the supplements for fourth edition were around powers. And this one here is for barbarians, druids, shamans, and wardens. And you just had a lot of these types of books. You had all of the other players' handbooks. It could get quite confusing. And then another thing was there was much more emphasis, in my opinion, on magic items. And so you almost needed dedicated books or ideas for magic items because, again, it was this assumption that heroes are powerful and that they kind of needed magic items.
What's that MMO mentality? As old Yahtzee over at The Escapist said in one of his videos, it's like, what do you need new gear for? He's like, what are you going to raid for? So I can raid to get the gear. And, well, what do you need good gear for? So I can raid with it. It's that MMO mentality. I need shinier pants. What can I kill to get shinier pants? We're all in pursuit of better pants and better boots. And that's really what it comes down to. And this just plays into that. To touch on something he said earlier, the fracturing of the fan base, Dungeons and Dragons 4th edition's abject failure is not on 4th edition. It's on Wizards of the Coast abandoning the OGL. Had they not abandoned the OGL and attempted to take it away and pushed Paizo into basically saying, well, you can't revoke what we did before, so we're just going to change names to protect the guilty and create Dungeons and Dragons 3.5 and call it Pathfinder and just keep doing what you were doing before, that would have never happened if they hadn't pissed all over the OGL. So it's a self-inflicted wound because Paizo would have stuck around and kept making supplements for 4th edition, which would have made 4th edition a better game and would have not made a direct competitor to Dungeons and Dragons. But, Wizards they got them shotgun shoes. They just love to shoot themselves in the foot.
By the time it was 2014, Wizards of the Coast decided that a new edition of D&D was in order. 4th edition hadn't performed particularly well compared with its predecessor, and after 6 short years, players were then faced with the reality of needing to fork out for another set of core rulebooks. 5th edition is the current edition of D&D, and I'm sure everyone at this stage that's watching is familiar with this edition. 5th edition really popularized D&D, and I mean really firmly entrenched it in popular culture. You've seen D&D in television shows like Stranger Things. There's a movie that came out called Dungeons and Dragons, and Critical Role and even games like Baldur's Gate 3 have all acted to popularize this edition of D&D. Arguably, there's more players than ever before. There's a sense within popular culture that this is really a behemoth of an edition, and I think we'll look back on this edition as kind of paving the way for that. Another good thing about 5th edition is it honestly tried to get back to its roots. It had strayed quite far from that in 4th edition, and as I said, some of that was innovation and some of that was just going in a different direction. And so 5th edition really made a concerted effort to reel some of that back and say, what is it about D&D that makes it D&D? And I remember as they were designing it, those were the sorts of questions that they just kept coming back to. What makes D&D D&D, and really kind of respecting the roots of the game while keeping some of the innovations that were made in 3rd and 4th edition.
I'm going to say this about 5th edition. I don't like it. All right. It's like the Apple of tabletop role-playing games, or it's really not even tabletop role-playing games. It's like the Apple product of D&D. It has training wheels you can't take off. But that is just like everything else. Bruce Lee always said, your strength is your weakness. Okay. The weakness of 5th edition is the kind of hand-holdy, Fisher Price, my first D&D book feel. It is the 14 death saves and 50,000 different ways to prevent you from dying, and take a nap against take a nap to get all your hit points back, and be able to redo all your fight nap, and always be at full power. Video gaminess and hand holdiness that the modern players expect because they have to the participation trophy generation nonsense. But that also made an extraordinarily accessible game. The thing about simplicity is it's pretty easy to figure it out. And once you got it figured out, you can start doing things to make it your own. And that creativity is what produces game masters. That vehicle for your creativity is what takes people and turns them into good game masters. And the health of a TTRPG is always based on the number of dedicated game masters you have. Because if you don't have game masters, you don't have a player base. Everybody on the planet can want to play 5th edition, but if there's no 5e game masters because they don't want to deal with whatever it is that 5e has, nobody's there to run the game. So your player base is kind of limited by the number of DMs that you can produce. 5e makes it very, very, very easy to jump in and be a DM. Beginning of this video, I talked about old generic Jenny D blocking me and how I was laughing about that, and laughing about how she's basically been playing role-playing games for all of 5 minutes. But she's able to sound like she actually knows what she's doing, talking about 5th edition Dungeons and Dragons on the internet for a living. And how is she able to do that? How is she able to sound like, how is she able to sound like she's not full of shit and phoning it in? Because it's so easy to pick up 5th edition and get serviceable at it that you can be somebody who just picked it up a year or two ago and is suddenly good enough to be listened to on how to play the game and how to create monsters and stuff like that. If Jenny D had picked up 3.5 in 2019 instead of 5th edition, well, she better damn well hope that her fanboy cosplay lovers threw a bunch of money at her, because she's going to need a full-time job to get good enough at 3.5 to start writing videos about it. Not so. 5th edition, play it for 6 months, you're basically an expert. It's got a very, very low ceiling. Unfortunately, also has a very, very low ceiling, which means that once you've kind of figured it out, you kind of start finding its limitations pretty quick.
Another difference or good thing about 5th edition was there was a slower release of content. Third edition certainly released a ton of books. Second edition was notoriously bloated, and even fourth edition to an extent had quite a few books. And so there's a real, at the time, Wizards did make a commitment to slow the releases down of supplements. By now, in 2023, we're seeing there is quite a plethora of books and options and stuff, but I don't think it's as much as some of the previous editions that we've seen. It's fairly inviting to new players, and it is colorful, and there's a real attempt to kind of create a bit of diversity while still giving players options. Players can make multiple choices while sort of sitting within a relatively simple framework. By now, there are also a lot of resources that you can use to help your game. One of the things that D&D 5e has done is gone back to its roots with a lot of published adventures while also making new content. In Tomb of Annihilation, for instance, you get some of those classic adventures that first appeared in first edition, and you see that with the Ghost, the Saltmarsh campaign and so forth. You've got Dwellers of the Forbidden City, and just some of the attempts here are just to kind of almost throw back to the past while doing that in sort of a fresh way. And then with Out of the Abyss, adventures like this, it's kind of a new thing, but it's still playing on tropes that we've experienced before, the Underdark, and exploring, having a whole campaign based around that Underdark experience. Now, some people have kind of debated the quality of 5th edition adventures, and we'll get to that in a little bit. But, there are options, and some of them are actually pretty good. On top of that, because it's the most recent edition of the game, it kind of receives the most support. And so you have something like Tolus, which was is Monte Cook's book. He was one of the designers in 3E, but this came out in the 2000 era, and he's re-released this for 5th edition. So the 5th edition gets a lot of support. There's a lot of pretty good third-party stuff. One of the things that is potentially a downside about this is, while it kind of takes an inspiration from some of those earlier editions, it kind of almost lacks its own personality. There's just something about it where it doesn't feel as quirky or individual or unique as some of the things that have come before it. I mean, even 4th edition, love it or hate it, had a real strong feel to it. It had its own thing going, and it was fairly unapologetic in the way it did this, whereas I feel like 5th edition is kind of amalgamating and trying to please everyone. Some of the releases with 5th edition feel really, like, for want of a better word, kind of half-assed.
This is not by any means an exclusive to Wizards of the Coast or Dungeons and Dragons thing here. The creative bankruptcy in entertainment that has been going on for at least the past decade, probably longer than that, but at least the past decade, just continues to get worse and worse. You look at Hollywood, for instance, and you don't see any new movies. There's no new original movie. Everything is either a thinly veiled reskin, a half-ass reboot, even worse, a reboot for modern sensibilities and modern audiences, which basically means neuter everything and just pump it full of woke stupidity and pandering and fan base pandering. It's all nostalgia pandering. D&D 5th edition is no different. Wizards of the Coast does not hire writers and designers and game players. They hire activists and tell them to go out and do it. The activists don't have the creative talent. They like to pretend they do, but they don't have the creative talent to really make good things. So what they do is they take good things that creative people in the past made, and they reimagine them, and they put them out as their own thing. And they say, look, they pat themselves on the back and just, sniff their own farts, talking about how, it's such a creative reimagining at this new imagining of the deck of many things. It's like, no, you took something that somebody else created. You put your whatever the hell you want to call it, fake Mary Sue Paladin character on top of it, and tried to pat yourself on, you dislocated your shoulder, patting yourself on the back about how creative you were, ripping off something from somebody else, slapping a bunch of stupidity on it, and then saying, ooh, it's associated with a disabled character, fake disabled character, pretender. And go buy it or you're a bigot. Moral, just complete creative bankruptcy, moral bankruptcy too, but complete creative bankruptcy. And so that's why it doesn't have any of its own character, because the only thing it can do is pretend to have somebody else's character.
Did a review on Spelljammer, and while I didn't take a really good read of the rules, it just left me feeling a little bit dissatisfied. The artwork is amazing. You get these really great visual artists, but it's lacking something. I don't know whether it's just the nostalgia for me, and maybe if it is, I need to be a little bit more open-minded about it. I genuinely try to do that, but time and time again, I just feel like the content is just a little bit bland and a little bit like they've phoned it in.
That's because it's like listening to a parrot read Shakespeare. Okay? It's like listening to a parrot read Shakespeare. Yes, the parrot is parroting out the words. It's reading the exact same words of Shakespeare that an actor or that Shakespeare himself was reading, but it lacks all of the understanding, all of the emotion, all of the personality. All you get is the words. And you wonder, it's like, man, something seems off. I seem to remember Othello being way more impactful than this. That's because the parrot doesn't understand Othello. He just knows the words. That's what you've got with D&D 5th edition. They don't understand the adventures that they're trying to do. They don't understand the monsters or the settings that they're trying to put together. They don't get what makes the content special. All they do is pick it up, parrot the words, and then look for the words that are going to offend the wrong professionally offended class, turn it over to some sensitivity readers to find new ways to be offended. That's the only creativity they have, is creating new ways to be offended. Then they send it back for sanitization, and there you get Shakespeare read by a parrot.
The corporate overlords of Hasbro are definitely felt in this edition. It feels a little bit cynical. It feels like you're just being given a product rather than something that's truly been produced out of love and inspiration. My mind kind of is drawn to some of the OGL debacle, where they tried to revoke the open gaming license, and then when they were called out for it, they really backtracked. And just things like that just kind of put a bit of a damper on the community feel and the goodwill that could exist and should exist for this edition of the game. As I said, it's brought people together, unlike other editions of D&D. I think most people would probably be okay to play this edition, but it's the opportunity is kind of lost because there's this real kind of really heavy-handed corporate thing going on, and you can feel the impact of that bottom dollar, the attempt to get money from this. I understand it, even it's a company and it needs to make money and it needs to be profitable, but that feeling, that sentiment gets in the way of the enjoyment of the actual product, and you feel that in the product. Dungeons and Dragons 5th edition feels very safe, like it's all the edges have been shaved off and it's this very rounded and smooth thing, but it's lost a lot of its vitality and the things that make it unique in the process. There's an attempt to make it inclusive and diverse for everyone, but I can't help but feel they're trying to do that because it's popular, not because it's authentic. And I think there are ways that you could really include the fandom and really truly be authentic in an approach to be diverse and to include people and to make people feel safe. But a lot of it just feels like they're blowing a trumpet and calling attention to it and kind of saying, hey, look how inclusive we are, when it doesn't feel authentic. Again, it just feels like kind of a corporate nod to inclusivity. And again, it kind of weirdly gets in the way of what makes an edition unique and what makes it creative and what even makes it dangerous. To me, 5th edition doesn't feel dangerous. It's fine. It's a fine edition, but it doesn't feel dangerous. It doesn't have a huge amount of character. And ultimately, it just feels a little bit bland because of their attempts to please everyone. I feel like I might have been a little bit harsh with 5th edition, and maybe I have been. I want to kind of reiterate that it is a really popular edition. Mechanically, it's actually really good. And I think if you're just wanting to play some edition, like play some D&D and try it out and just do it with some friends, this is a great edition. So we come to the end of the series. We've explored original Dungeons and Dragons in 1974, and we've gone all the way to the present with 5th edition. This video series has really been about trying to build some awareness around the different editions of D&D. It's not saying this edition is better than another. It's not saying you should play this and this one sucks. My intention has been to be tried to be fair and balanced about every edition, to really look at some of the strengths and the weaknesses.
Okay, so I'm gonna kind of back off right there. I think he did do a very good job of being, quote, fair and balanced about the whole thing. He definitely, you could tell his biases in there and his thoughts where he tried and soften the blow some. And overall, that's pretty good overview for somebody who doesn't know anything about it. One video I will suggest, and I am going to link here, is I'm a huge fan of the channel DM It All. I really wish they put out more content more often. But DM It All did a very good, video for the different editions of Dungeons and Dragons. And, he does a very good job of saying, you might want to play this version for this. I might even do a reaction to that video, even though I've seen it 100 times, just because of how good I think it is. So I think this is pretty good and fair and balanced, and it's pretty accurate. I think he leaves out some of the reasoning on some things, but you never know. You tell me where I'm right and where I'm wrong. Let me know in the comment section below where I screw things up. And if you sat through this nearly hour-long video, I really appreciate it. So like, share, subscribe, and see if you get somebody else to give me 60 minutes of their time. See you guys next time.